Good Monday morning of the 19th week of Ordinary Time in the calendar of the church. As you can see, I'm in my St. Mark's t-shirt. I was just out riding my bike and taking a little for a run and this and that. So I'm kind of grimier than usual, but I thought I'd like to get the videos when I have the time and I'm not pressured. I want to get them, started. And once I get going and I like doing it, but other than that, I think, I don't know what to say, which I don't. I still don't. But today was interesting because when I read the gospel in the first reading, I thought, holy moly, I have no idea what to say. But then I saw that August 14th in 1941, Maximilian Kolbe was a Polish Franciscan priest, was executed in Auschwitz. And it's a famous story about him because he took the place of another man who was a married man with a family to be executed. He took his place. And it's interesting because when he was canonized by John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, I think it was in 1982. I get this stuff all wrong, okay? He's called a martyr of charity because he wasn't killed because he was a Catholic or anything else. He was killed because he took a place in charity of the other man. If he didn't, he'd probably survived the war. He would have survived the camp. Who knows? The man whose life he took, whose place he took, survived the war and in fact came to the canonization of Maximilian Kolbe. It's an amazing story. I think those stories need to be told about the Holocaust and about not only the Jewish victims and heroes within it, but also the Christians who were also heroic and who died in the camps. The vast majority of the victims there were Jews who were killed just for being Jews. The Christians would have been killed because they stood up to Hitler. That's what I think. I could be wrong. Of course, I don't know. But I do know that you have your Maximilian Kolbes. You have people, religious order guys especially, they went to prison camps. And they were threats to the Nazis. Anyway, I think it's very important, even in our own times, to recognize the capacity we have both for horror and heroism. We've had it wonderfully good in America. We have never been persecuted. We have never been under the gun. We have never been called to martyrdom, or very, very rarely. In fact, I don't know of any incidents of it. In that sense, we have been culturally comfortable in our culture. Our legal system, which is probably the constitutional law, as good as probably the best in history. Best in the world and best in history. And we have flourished as a Catholic Christian community in America. Of course, we were persecuted in the beginning, at the time of the foundation of the country. But it wasn't in the same way, in the same manner of the Holocaust or anything even remotely like it. But we were prejudiced against, principally by the Protestant Puritan community. Whatever. But the truth is we have flourished in America. We have flourished in here. At the same time, I think it is wise not to take it with a certain conceit. I mean, you got to be careful because it is so easy to be called to the heroic. It won't become, I don't know how to think about that too much. But I think the voice of the church at times can speak up, not against a nation or against a government, but against the culture. Even our Lord did that. Christ did it. That's what gets him in trouble with the Jewish leadership. He was holding them accountable. He wasn't asking them to do something wrong. He was asking them to do it right, you see. And I think the danger for us in the future, could be wrong, I don't know, is that we are more and more going to be challenged. The abortion issue was one of the first ones where really we had to stand up for it, for the right of the unborn. And I think our own deep commitment to the sacrament of marriage, just the sacrality and the permanence of marriage. We were one of the last voices out there who are holding to the sacrality of marriage. And marriage is more than a legal contract. It's a profound and radical moral contract and a sacrament. the love of Christ for the church, the love of his spouses for each other, sharing in the cross of Christ. But this is a profound mystery, but it's not to be taken lightly. Not to be taken lightly. It's not just a convention of society or a necessity for child rearing, though it is certainly that. It is a sacrament. It's as much a sacrament as the Eucharist is a sacrament, well, let alone the priesthood, you see, or baptism. It's one of the 7 sacraments, marriage. See? And I think the church's voice is so crucial in that, and yet it's a voice that is becoming less and less heard and muted, far more muted by the conventions of our time. In a sense, the transience of marriage, how many of the marriages fail. I think over 50% of our marriages fail now. That's a lot of dysfunctional life. Think of the lives of the children. They're torn in conflict from the time they're little. Okay? And of course, the rights of the unborn. The church is continually preaching a message, not a punitive message, but a message of life and the affirmation of life. Both the physical life, the life of the unborn, but also the moral life and the well-being of spouses and parents, children. I think she's becoming more and more important to the society as the society in the West especially abandons its own cultural, moral, and spiritual roots. The church may be the last voice to speak to the core of our culture, the values of our culture. Which means, therefore, just what Christ was doing to the Pharisees and the scribes. We're going to be rejected. We're going to be hated, as much from within as from without. In fact, more so from within, because we're continually reminding our own people and our own culture that we have a sacred mission, a profound humanism, the human well-being, all human well-being, and the sacredness of human love. The sacredness of human love, not just its conventionality, but its holiness, you see. The church, I think, whatever this is worth, the church is always better off. The church is always better off when she speaks at a culture, speaks to the culture, but is not a voice of the culture, culture. She can get too comfortable in her own culture. She's always a prophetic voice. And the prophet is always uncomfortable in his own time, right? He speaks to the truth at the time. He calls us back. The prophet calls us back to what is fundamentally good, true, and beautiful in ourselves, in our culture, in our lives. And often we don't want to hear it because such beauty and goodness requires a commitment and a sacrifice. Okay? It's better to go along with the crowd, to go along with the times. We live in an interesting time. I think we live in the greatest era since the 4th century. I say that at church morning after, they'll be sick of me all these years. But I think so because I think we are entering into a global community now, as we did in the 4th century when it became Romanized. Okay, when the church became Romanized, now the church is becoming globalized, and she's going to be an extraordinarily important prophetic voice. But the church also got martyred at that time, and she could get martyred now. But out of the blood of the martyrs came the faith. Could be, we will be called to martyrdom. We might be called to it. If Christ himself was martyred on Good Friday, and the church off and on in history has been martyred, who's to say we won't be? See? The church always must preach the gospel to the world, whether it wants to hear it or not. And it might be costly. But it is also what we are called to be and what to do and what to say.